All right, I think we're ready to begin. My name is Kevin Heinz, and I am the managing editor of Essay Review, or WordVice as we're also known, and welcome to our seminar on writing effective introduction and discussion sections for social sciences and humanities. And a little bit about our company before we begin the webinar. Essay Review is an editing service, and we edit all kinds of academic papers, research papers, clinical reports, any manuscripts for submission to academic journals, and cover and rebuttal letters for journals. So any kind of academic papers that you need, we can edit it. And we have experts in hundreds of subject areas. So whether you're social sciences, humanities, natural sciences, we probably have an editor in your subdiscipline. So I want to begin by discussing why we're talking about the introduction and discussion sections specifically. And the reason is that for most academic papers, they have the largest combined word count of any section. And they summarize the study and explain its importance. And they're the most prone to language, style, and organizational errors, especially for ESL writers. So these sections, especially for social sciences, tend to have a lot of writing. And as you can see, comparing the two structures, here we have the social science or natural science paper section, and it looks a little bit different than the humanities, which is on the right here. But both of these still have these similar sections: introduction, thesis statement, results section in the social sciences, and then conclusion in both kinds of papers. But what I want you to keep in mind here during the lecture is not just the structure of the two kinds of papers, social science and humanities, but the form phrases or signal phrases that we want to use to show readers what we're talking about, and also the language errors that we're going to discuss, because these tend to apply to all kinds of papers. And the lecture today will first start by discussing some common writing mistakes, and we'll look at those mistakes throughout the lecture. Then we'll analyze the introduction section in detail. Then we'll look at the discussion and conclusion sections. And finally, we'll discuss some more common grammar and style errors in research writing. And of course, there are many, many kinds of errors, both in style and grammar and punctuation. So we're just going to look at a few in detail, a few common ones. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. I've prepared some Q&A questions in advance that are common questions that people ask. But if you have more, I will jump on the webinar at the end and can answer those for you in real time. So let's begin looking at some common writing mistakes. So I've divided these into 4 categories. First, wordiness. This can mean overuse of passive voice, too many prepositional phrases, turning verbs into nouns. Wordiness is essentially using too many words to describe something. Irrelevant or redundant information. This can mean repeating the same words again and again, or putting the information in the wrong section. Vocabulary issues. This can mean using colloquialisms or non-academic terms to describe your work, and incorrect terms. And we'll look at some ways to improve your vocabulary. And then finally, unnatural, awkward phrasing. Both vocabulary and phrasing are difficult for ESL writers to fix, but we've provided a few tips in this lecture and as well on our website atessayreview.co.kr and wordvice.com that have a lot more detail for how to fix these kinds of issues. So let's begin by looking at the introduction section and discussing the function of the introduction. So in most papers, you want to first establish the context or the background of the work. So this means describing the topic being studied right away with citations, and then discussing primary research that supports your findings or summarizes the study or related studies to your work. Next, we're going to state the purpose of the work, and this will include the hypothesis for social science papers or the research question or the problem. In the humanities, we're going to use a thesis statement, but in the humanities, you'll see the thesis statement will come a little bit earlier in the introduction. You want to answer all of these questions in the introduction. What are you studying? Why is it important? What did we know before your study? And how will this study advance our knowledge, both in this specific domain and in other related domains? So the introduction is the first thing that readers will see, and so therefore it's very important to answer these questions. Some general style guidelines. You might be wondering what voice, active or passive. Usually we'll use the active voice as much as possible. So for example, XYZ results have been reported by. This is a bit wordy, right? We have to use 4 words. So instead of this, we would say previous studies have reported XYZ results. So this general subject, verb, object, active voice structure is the way you want to structure your sentences. For first person, some of the first person usage is okay. For example, we sought to determine, but you might focus more on the study rather than you as a researcher. So our study sought to determine. As far as general content, we want to only use highly relevant sources, obviously. So when you're discussing related literature, you don't want to be too broad. You want to use keywords from your title in the introduction section right away to focus the exact problem and to make it easier for researchers to find your work. And you also want to define your key terms right away. And of course, you want to make your purpose statement or hypothesis very, very clear and outstanding. And we'll show you some form phrases or signal phrases for how to do that. As we looked at in the first graphic, the inverted triangle or upside down triangle shows that you start with the most general information and then focus down to the specific problem. And some ways you can create the introduction is to start with the specific hypothesis. You'll probably have that in mind before you write, right? When you're doing the study, you have a hypothesis, and then you're going to build upon that and decide what your context is. What are the research questions that your study is going to try to answer? So for example, if your purpose statement is, the purpose of this study is to determine the satisfaction rate of high school students, the context or background that you might want to include are, recent studies and the factors that created this situation. And these are just some examples of the sentences that might be included. So several recent studies have demonstrated X. Many factors can affect high school student satisfaction rates, and then specifically using time ranges. Between 1995 and 2011, over 2 million high school students dropped out. Notice that these are concrete details, and we always want to be as detailed as possible when articulating anything in the study. So this is the inverted triangle. And again, this is more applicable to scientific or social science studies. So you have the broadest information, what is known, and then next, a little bit narrower, what is unknown, or what are the gaps your study will fill. And then last, in 1 or 2 sentences, is your hypothesis or your statement of purpose. How and why should we fill the gap? So more general to more specific, the literature or the knowledge that undergirds, that supports your study, and then your hypothesis or purpose statement. Okay. So we're going to break each section down into several subsections. So for looking at the social sciences, we'll start with social science structure. You want to start with the topic and importance and identify the key terms and phrases. So include the topic, the prevalence, the population affected, or other central information. And throughout this lecture, I will show you some useful verbs and phrases, and I've highlighted these usually in red or green. So verbs that you can use: afflict, affect, impact, are created by, associated with. There's a ton of verbs, and this is another material that we have on our website as well. We have a lot of verbs. So, for example, at least 14 specific conditions of mental illness are linked to trauma in early adolescence. Foreclosure impacts over 1 million per year worldwide annually. So right away, you're discussing the importance of this study. This is before you've discussed your specific study. This is the establishing the importance. Generally, in this section, right away, you want to use more interesting and compelling language. So use active verbs and include details. So instead of this sentence, a major cause of poverty in the US is lack of education. Nothing wrong with that, but a little bit uninteresting. So Instead, nearly 25 million impoverished children attend underfunded schools. This is much more concrete. So right away you're getting to the details. What's the population affected? And then you're using a stronger verb, attend versus is. Again, less interesting, a significant percentage of older people in the US have psychological disorders. So what is a significant percentage? 5%, 30%? Here's more details. Major depression afflicts an estimated 10% of American adults over age 50. Strong verb, afflicts. 10%, specific number or statistic, and then the affected population over the age of 50. So right away, we know the sample group and we know a bit more information. In this section as well, you want to identify the topic and it's important to the subject area, and use keywords from your title right away in the first paragraph or two. So let's say our title is disability status, housing tenure, and residential attainment in the metropolitan America. This is my example, by the way. Some of the keywords of my study are disability, residential attainment, housing discrimination. So these keywords are what researchers can use to find my study. So right away, when they open the study, or even in the abstract for this, you can include a sentence or two from the introduction in your abstract. You can see the keywords in red and the concrete details that provide specific information in green. So in 2010, approximately 56.7 million people, percentage of the US civilian non-institutionalized population had a disability. So we have a lot of details right away, and we have our keywords: disability, had a disability, residential attainment, housing discrimination. So we have not only the keywords, but related keywords right away. We don't want to be too broad with our background. Even though it's a broader section, we want to use these keywords. Very important. In the second part of the introduction, you want to establish the context by providing brief and balanced review of the literature. So this is the literature review. The literature review can very much change depending on the type of study that you're doing, whether it's longitudinal or a cohort study, and the journal that you are submitting to. So always look at the journal, some examples from the journal before writing your paper. So these are some form phrases that will signal to the reader what you are discussing. The motivations for this research and its importance stems from several existing studies. So whenever you see this, form phrases, note that you can use these in any study. This is not plagiarism to use these, but they tell the reader right away what the rest of the information is about. So form phrases are very important to use. Secondly, this paper marks the introductory application of this method, this model. So you're discussing the model based upon previous studies and the models used. This contribution is important as now you're discussing the importance of this study. So you're doing a lot of work in the literature review. You're not only just talking about previous studies, you're linking the studies to your current study as well. But there's a lot going on here too, so we can get into some more details. So when citing research, you should use general references to speak about the current knowledge that is known in the discipline, and then specific references for more closely related research. On the left-hand column here, you can see some more grammar, some grammar points here. So use the perfect tense to describe previous research. So generally, general references when you're describing research in general, not a specific study. Recent studies have shown a strong link between red meat consumption and heart disease. We're using the perfect tense because we're not pointing to a specific study. So many studies on this period and fashion, a strong connection. Reveal is our verb. What is our conjugation going to be? Many studies have revealed. Right. However, you can use a present or simple present or simple past when referring to interpretation of the work or to a specific work. So for example, research conducted at Seoul Hospital, and then you have the specific citation, And then demonstrates, so a simple present or demonstrated, depending on the journal and the style format you're using. Let's see what we can do with draw. So Kim, citation, a correlation between. Has drawn? Well, we're referring to one study, so we can say past tense. It's a study that in the past. So Kim drew a correlation. Some style guides, such as MLA, will use the present tense here, right? So Kim draws a correlation. So again, it really depends on the style guide you're using, whether you use past or present. In this section as well, let's look at some form phrases we can use to establish the context with the literature. So we'll start with relevant primary literature. So in the green, we have form phrases. There is a small but growing literature that addresses this issue. So you could almost just copy and paste this sentence into this section of your work, and then underneath that, list the literature that applies to your work. Okay. Moreover, this person concluded that households, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So again, you don't want to include too lengthy of explanations of any given work. Sometimes you'll see in medical studies the explanations are a sentence or even a phrase. It really depends how much you're using this work to undergird or to support your study. If you're just using a lot of studies to show the history of your study or the current knowledge, then you want to be as brief as possible with each citation. Okay, and now you want to use previous research to discuss methodology and what is missing or unknown. So how long you spend on discussing the previous methodology really depends on how long your study is, how much space you have. You only want to use literature that shows the importance of your study. So again, using form phrases. However, no research has examined disability status, etc. According to NFHA, enforcement of the Fair Housing Act is lower in the sales market relative to the rental market. So the methodology here, you're not only discussing the background, but what has been used in previous research. Additionally, in the rental market, let's see, this is not exactly methodology. Okay, here we go. The 2009 National AHS data are the best suited to this analysis. Good. So that tells the reader that you'll likely use a similar method of analysis in your study as this previous AHS data study. You could also say, let's say you want to use a different study than this. You might say the 2009 National AHS data are not well suited to this analysis. In this case, you would be contrasting your particular methodology with a previous study, and that's okay as well. Here's some more form phrases, and I'll go through these quickly. So again, you can find these. We have an article titled "The Useful Phrases for Academic Writing," and these are broken up by abstract, methods, introduction, etc. However, little research to date has examined X. This raises the question of whether X is true. Therefore, it is important to fill this gap in the literature by doing this method, X method. This paper is the first of its kind to address these questions. Okay, this discusses the novelty of your paper. And you probably won't be the first one to use a method, but if you are, this is a good sentence. Okay, so these form phrases and others are useful in showing why your study is important. Okay, we'll discuss more about transitions, but just to introduce these, transitions can draw connections between what is known and what is unknown. So first, what you can do in the literature review is state what is known. So many studies have indicated that red meat is not healthy. Then you can use a key phrase that identifies this missing information and use a transition to connect them. However, the causal link between X and Y has not been confirmed. So this transition, without the transition, let's see here. We'll see. Without, however, the reader might have to do some guessing to see how they're connected. So the transition really makes the reading smoother, really makes the argument smoother. Let's see how this works in another example. Previous research has revealed a strong correlation between e-cigarettes and pancreatic cancer. So here's no transition, just going right into the next sentence. Not much is known about how e-cigarettes and pancreatic cancer are connected. Nothing grammatically wrong with this, but without this short transition, it makes the reader have to do a little more work. So using the transition, however, a strong causal link between e-cigarettes and pancreatic cancer has yet to be firmly established. We're connecting, we're showing the reader how the first sentence, which is this one, previous research has revealed, and then the second sentence, not much is known, how these are connected. And we're also using more precise description. So instead of not much is known, well, what is not known? A causal link has not been established. A causal link isn't known. Okay. Next in the introduction, or last, I should say, you're going to use the previous research to explain methodology in detail. So again, we'll just have some form phrases, and we have a lot to go through, so we'll go through these quickly. To explain the variation in housing, we begin with the spatial assimilation model. So you're actually telling the reader what you're doing. You're not just saying, this is the assimilation model. You're saying, in order to examine this aspect of our study, we're going to use this method. So you're being very explicit and clear. And also, we will use a discrimination model. Okay? According to the spatial assimilation model, socioeconomic status determines the residential distribution of households across neighborhoods. The theory of spatial assimilation argues that. Okay, so you're going into further detail about how the methodology has been used in previous research to show some conclusions, to draw some conclusions that your study is using. So you don't have to start from scratch. You're using what is known and the methods that have been used to derive those findings. Here's your transition. Thus, as SES increases, these minority populations, etc. So you're using thus to connect this section and this section. And the transition is doing a lot of work here. It's very important. Okay. Here's some more. For this research, the spatial assimilation model will be used to explain. In this case, the model maintains that, similar to the place stratification model used to explain X, the discrimination model offers. In this study I chose is from PLOS, I believe, Public Library of Science. There is a lot of methodological literature being reviewed. You might not have this much in your work, but you can see that for every main sentence, I believe this is actually one paragraph, but for the first sentence, the form phrases are telling the reader exactly what the upcoming model, what the upcoming analysis of the model is doing. Okay, so here's some key terms and phrases for the literature review. Previous studies have indicated, previous studies have revealed connections between. Current studies, okay, we're going to use the present tense here. Current studies reveal, current studies show, current studies indicate, etc. So there's a lot of verbs. Make sure to use the correct verb, of course, but rather than just is, are, were, it's better to use a higher level academic verb. Let's look at some examples. Recent research on poverty in Korea has revealed a relationship between income and mental illness. Related studies are revealing connections between income level and mental illness. A common mistake. Oh, we also, by the way, here we could. This shows that this is ongoing, right? It's the progressive tense. Are revealing. We could also use reveal, but this shows a little bit more action in progress. It's a style decision. One common mistake is the authors make is to use the simple past to discuss multiple studies. So prior research demonstrated a correlation with no citation. What should we use here instead when we don't have the specific study? Has demonstrated, right? We want to use the perfect when we don't have a specific study. to refer to. Okay, next we can discuss missing or unknown information. These are just some transitions again. However, but, although there has been significant research conducted on X, and then next, so if this is part A, this is part B. So, however, the correlation between X, although there has been significant research conducted on X, the specific causes of X are unknown, etc. Okay, so however, the correlation between X and Y has not been firmly established. So as you can see, there's a lot of choices to make for the form phrases, but these are all sentences, these are all phrases, I should say, that don't include any specific content about your study. And there's a lot of content, there's a lot of words being taken up by these form phrases. So very useful in any academic study. Let's see how they can work. But multiple studies have reported inconsistencies in the application of dyes to textile design in ancient India. One specific transition word that can combine known and missing information into one sentence is although. And I like although because it can create longer sentences because although is a subordinating conjunction. You have a comma in the middle, and you can vary the sentence structure a little bit and actually decrease word count. So let's look at it. Although some research has indicated that ancient Indians used henna exclusively, there are insufficient data to demonstrate that other natural dyes were used as well. So we could also say, we could start with this sentence. There are insufficient data to demonstrate other natural dyes were used. However, some research has indicated that ancient Indians used henna exclusively. Right? So we have two sentences, and we're adding a couple more words. Okay, discussing the theoretical framework, here's an example in a sociological article. So in this part of the introduction, we are explaining the theory or lens that your paper used or studied, and this can also be the rationale of the approach your study took. So you're talking about why you use this approach. To explain the variation, etc., we begin with X. So to do something, we did this. This is the scaffolding of your work, telling the reader why you did this. Why did you begin with the spatial model? Well, to explain the variation in housing. But you've combined this in one short sentence. Some useful phrases to introduce theory and method application. I don't want to go through these too much because there's so many, but let's just look at an example. This research will use X model to show connections between A and B. Okay. This paper will explore the causes of the French Revolution from a Marxist materialist lens, using resource scarcity as a framework. So, one very brief way to discuss this framework, and the form phrases are doing a lot of work. Well, what's this paper doing? This paper is exploring the causes using scarcity as a framework. Here's although in action again. Although many studies have emphasized X, this paper argues that it was in fact Y. So although in addition to combining two sentences into one, it offsets the two parts of the sentence. So you know that, like, although A is true, the second part of the sentence is like the but, right? So even though this is true, however, this paper argues it was this. So this kind of tells the reader what is coming up in the sentence. Okay, discussing the flow of information, which is my way of saying the structure and how the information is connected. You want to clearly state your research question hypothesis statement. Oh, so this is the final part, I should say, of your introduction. So the most important sentence in your research paper is the hypothesis or statement of purpose. And the placement of this phrase depends on the kind of paper, whether you're writing social science, humanities. In literary or historical analysis, it can be in the first paragraph, usually at the end of the first paragraph. In social science studies, it's usually in the final paragraph of the introduction. But either way, there's a few form phrases. You can be very explicit, you can be very obvious when it comes to discussing your hypothesis, right? This paper study does this. The purpose of this study was to do X. The objective of the study is we investigated 2 possible mechanisms to explain X. So there's some differences in what these phrases are telling us, like whether they're a purpose or whether you're simply discussing what the paper did. But the form phrases have in common that they're very obvious. They tell the reader exactly, and they use the word paper, study. So here's some key verbs. This paper describes, investigates, lays out, presents, analyzes. And I should say here that when we're talking about what the paper or the study does, we're using the present tense, right? Because we're discussing the analysis, the study. We're not talking about what you did. When it comes to the results, you're going to use the past tense, but we won't discuss the results here. But in the introduction, talking about what the paper is doing, you will use the present tense. And make sure to use the right verb, of course. Okay, so here's some more form phrases and in examples. This is from a psychology paper, and this is a hypothesis or purpose statement. This study hypothesized that an analysis of X. In fashion design, which is humanities, under the guidance of such ideas, this essay imagines. So notice that the word study, essay, paper is used to show, to discuss, like in greater. You're looking back and saying, what is this paper doing? That tells the reader right here, this paper, this study. And again, in social science, hypotheses are in the final paragraph. Humanities are in the opening paragraph. And the way to know, this is going to be like using the right thesis, using the thesis in the right place is always going to be a question that authors will ask. And it might depend on where the journal prefers it. So read as many examples from that journal as possible before writing your thesis, before writing this most important sentence. Okay, here's some more key terms and phrases for an hypothesis or purpose statement. We determined that this study sought to find out. This study confirms, analyzes, examines, identifies. Here's some examples that I pulled from random studies, so you'll see there's a lot of consistency. Our study identified racial disparities. This would be summarizing the results. So that's why you see here, it doesn't say this study seeks to identify. Right here, you are using the past tense because in your paper you can discuss that racial disparities, but sometimes the past tense is used. I shouldn't contradict myself, but usually the present tense is used because you're referring to the analysis. So you could also say this paper identifies. Sometimes study is used in the past. Paper is almost always uses the present tense. For describing the purpose in a comparative history paper, this paper compares the social mobility. Describing the purpose of the study in an anthropology paper. In this paper, I narrate the history of migration. So this is what's known as a direct thesis. You have the subject, I narrate. I am doing this. Actually, these are all direct, right? Because the paper is doing this. Our study is doing this. In humanities papers, as we'll see, maybe on the next slide, there's a couple ways to introduce the purpose. Let's look quickly at the study. This is kind of reiterating what we said. So we'll look in more detail at the humanities now. Okay, so in a literary analysis, for example, in humanities papers, the thesis statement is usually in the first or second paragraph. And the structure, as you can see, is we still have an introduction and a thesis, but that's 10% or less of the paper usually. It's 1 or 2 paragraphs. The body constitutes the majority, in which you have evidence, reason, details, counter evidence, and then finally a short discussion or conclusion. So quite a bit different than the social sciences, where you have a lot in the introduction and a lot of discussion. There's a lot of that combined in the body of the humanities. So let's discuss the difference between direct thesis statement and indirect. So here, let's just look at, in green is the thesis. In this paper, I argue that she is correct in identifying the characteristics of Plains culture. However, she tends to overemphasize the impact that a greater awareness of the Plains can have for all Americans. All right, the most important line I want to point at is here. In this paper, I argue that. So you're basically saying what your thesis. You're waving the flag to the reader, saying this paper is saying this. I am arguing this. Very obvious. However, I would say most humanities papers take the indirect thesis statement approach. And I think it's a little bit more sophisticated. Rather than detracting from the positive sense of her life there, however, her critical perspectives make her work more real and lead the reader to want to get to know her and the Plains better. You might be asking, as a lot of non-humanities majors would ask, I am a humanities major, and it's kind of very different how humanities papers frame the thesis, but you might be asking, how do I know that this is the thesis? It doesn't say, in this paper, we are arguing X. Well, the placement is very important, right? So you have the introduction of the work. We know what the background, we know what the work is about, and then some basic kind of arguments, but more of like a known assessment about the work. And then at the end of this paragraph is where you put the thesis. So we know it's the thesis based upon the placement and the strength of the argument. And those are details that we would go into further in a humanities course. Next, you're going to establish the context by providing a brief and balanced review of the literature. So the literature can demonstrate the importance of the topic and support your hypothesis, just as in a social science paper. As these are form phrases as well. As Murray asserts in his paper entitled Seeds of the Apple, Shakespeare's characters are the archetypes. So you have as X says, and notice asserts is the MLA way of presenting your literature. Furthermore, other writers have noted X. All right, so we won't spend too much time on the variations, and I should have said the majority of this lecture will be focused on social sciences, but all of these form phrase issues apply to all academic papers. One writing issue that is very common as an editor I see every day is wordiness. Using too many words to describe something, repeating yourself. One way of using too many words is to use the passive voice versus the active. So let's look at an example. Positive effects have been indicated by previous studies in which this technique has been tested. That's so many words, have been indicated by. We don't need that many words. How can we change this? We're going to move this part to the front, the subject. Change the sentence to an active voice. Previous studies testing this technique have indicated positive effects. And note that we're using the perfect tense here. This sentence is too wordy and awkward. How can we improve it? However, although it may be stated by some authors, that's pretty long. How can we change that? This is 27 words, this sentence. Well, we have some authors, so let's move that here after although, right? Although some authors state, and we don't need however here, right? Because although is doing the work. Although some authors state that these historical factors are unrelated, there is sufficient evidence to show that they are strongly correlated. And we didn't edit this enough, apparently. Okay, so this is 22 words. You've already saved 5 words in this sentence that is doing the same work. And both of these are saying the same thing. Okay, let's take a short quiz now. So what function does this sentence perform? However, until this study, no research had examined disability status disparities in residential attainment separately by housing tenure. Is this identifying the topic and its general importance? Is it justifying the methodology or approach? Is it showing what is missing from the literature? or is it providing a purpose statement or hypothesis? I'll let you think about that for 5 seconds. All right, so I believe that it is both justifying the methodology and showing what is missing, right? Until this study, no research had examined. So you're justifying your methodology, and you're saying previous work didn't do this, right? And however is the way we can tell right away, right? However, until my study, no research had done this. All right, what is the best verb or verb phrase to use in this hypothesis example? Accordingly, the aim of this study is to verb whether there exists a single forecasting model which can predict fashion consumer trends. The aim of this study is to say, to make a conclusion, to determine, to seek to evaluate. So this writing issue has to do with the academic level and the wordiness. Think about that. Well, say is pretty colloquial, make a conclusion is pretty long, determine might be good, seek to evaluate is too long, determine is the best verb here. The aim of this study is to determine. So as you can see, the verb is very important here, especially in your hypothesis, or your statement of purpose, I should say here. Okay, last question. Which writing issue does this sentence contain? This paper talks about livelihoods of people in Rauta, the ones who come from various places of origin and who are bringing different cultures to do and transform their livelihoods. Is it wordy? Do we have excessive pronouns? Are there vocabulary issues, non-academic terms? Is it redundant, or is there irrelevant content? Or is it awkward and overlong? And I'll give you a hint. There's 3 answers here. It is wordy, there's vocabulary issues, and it's awkward. So we have the ones who come from various places of origin and who are bringing, there's a wordiness issue. Non-academic terms, here, do, we could use a better verb, right? Awkward and overlong sentence, that goes along with the wordiness. So let's see how we can change it. Instead of talks about, how about explores? The ones who, we don't need that, right? We can just say who come from various places. Who are bringing? How about just bring, who bring different cultures? And then instead of do, establish. And this is also shorter and stronger. All right, now let's take 2 seconds before we discuss the discussion and conclusion. Okay, the discussion is the final section of the research paper, or the conclusion in the humanities. And some fields combine the results and discussion into one, so I don't want to get too into details saying, this is exactly what you need to add, but we'll talk about generally what is happening in the discussion. And the order is generally similar. You have an individual result presented, and then you have in the discussion that result in the same order. So result 1 is discussed first, result 2 discussed second, etc. So this section, you're going to interpret the results in light of what was known and explain a new understanding, interpreting the results. You're going to discuss implications and limitations, talking about the importance of these findings and to both your field and to humanity, or to the wider science. And then you're going to suggest further research, usually, especially in social sciences, or where you've done an experiment or a study that involves participants, a clinical study, for example. You're going to suggest other research and ways to answer related questions or do the work better. And then usually you'll have a concluding paragraph. In both social sciences and humanities, you're going to summarize the importance of the work. You're going to sell the importance of the work. So this is where a little bit of ethos comes into play. You don't want to go too far and say, my study is the most important study, but you want readers to be left with that impression that your study was important. Some humanities and journals only have the conclusion. There's no discussion, or they're blended into one. So again, we want to make that distinction. Generally, the style is similar to the introduction, using the active voice. Some passive voice is okay if it's not awkward or wordy, but here's a passive voice here. It was revealed in our descriptive analyses. How can we change this? Well, we can move this subject to the beginning. Our descriptive analysis revealed that, or descriptive analyses, I should be consistent. 2 clues are provided by the findings presented here. Are provided. The findings presented here provide 2 clues. Easy, and just a little bit easier to read, right? As far as first person, some is okay, but only if it's specific and clear. Our observation of the rise of poverty implies. Is the observation important here? Probably not. So the rise in poverty, or the findings, if that's what you're discussing, the rise in poverty that you found implies X. Your observation is not what is important. It can therefore be concluded that France. How about here? We could probably change to a personal pronoun such as we or our study or one. We can therefore conclude that France was in a state of chaos. And this might sound too personal, so you can use one to refer to anybody, to a person reading your study. How can the author rewrite this awkward sentence? It was revealed by us in the results that blah 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 kept on going among renters. The results can become the subject. The results reveal, and again, well, here we have, it looks like passive, right? So it was revealed. Let's use the simple present because we're interpreting the results. The results reveal X on disability residential outcomes persisted instead of kept on going, right? We're saving terms, we're saving words, and we're making it more academic. All right, as far as the structure, I don't want to go into this right now because there's just so many potential elements, and we'll see the structure as we go through each part. So here's the not inverted triangle now, the actual regular triangle. You start with this interpretation of specific results, and this is social sciences, I should be clear. You compare them to other findings and discuss the implications, a little bit broader in scope. And then even broader, you can discuss further research that might be needed to elaborate on your findings or to make your study better. And then the conclusion, which is a brief selling of your study, or it can be a summary of what you did. In the humanities paper, as you can see in this blown up section here, you'll just simply restate your thesis, not in the exact same words. You're not going to copy and paste it from the introduction, but you can reiterate it. You can write it in a slightly different way, and then your conclusion, which can also be a broader implication, or even how your findings could be applied in other areas. That sounds a little bit vague, so let's see what that looks like. Okay, but anyways, you'll start in the discussion, and here we'll be talking about specifically sociology, social sciences, and even hard sciences. You'll start by interpreting the results and data. And some tips is you can use a subheading or introductory sentence to show the reader what you're doing. If you can use a subheading, depends on the journal, then you should do that. Use a heading. Summarize the research objectives if needed. Sometimes that takes too much time, so it just really depends on the journal whether you need to repeat what your objectives were. Present the interpretation in the order presented in the results. So make sure that result 1, discussion 1, result 2, discussion 2. And then start with an interpretation of main findings and then details. This is true for every essay you will write, as well as academic paper. Any work you want to write, you want to start with the main finding in a paragraph and then discuss the supporting details afterwards. So let's look. Here we have in the ordering terms in green, and then in red we'll have past tense, and blue we have present tense, just to make it clear. So in this introductory sentence to the discussion, the primary objective of this paper was to examine the nature of disability differences, status differences, etc. So this author in this study, again, this is a very, very long study, so there's a lot of room here. They're repeating what they told us in the introduction. It might not be necessary to do that in your paper, but they do the ordering terms first, and then later second, really help give the work structure. And I want you to focus on the internal logic within a given paragraph. So you have this topic sentence that gives the main issues of what the section will address and gives the main finding. So let's just read what's in green. Second, controlling for relevant socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. To what extent does disability status shape the residential attainment of owners and rentals? So this was a research question that their study sought to answer. Again, they have a lot of room to rehash, to rediscuss what they brought up in the results. But what's important is in blue are all supporting details. And here they talk about the results. So if you don't want to actually re-ask these questions in your paper, you could just erase the green and start with the results. The results of our logistic regression and OLS models indicated that the nature of the disparities observed in our descriptive analyses were nearly the same as those. So these are, in this case, it's actually a main finding. So you're starting with the topic sentence here is the research question, and then the main finding becomes the second layer. Third, is the impact of disability status the same? So again, we're using first, second, and third to give the reader a mental picture, a mental scaffolding of how of the order of the discussion. Okay, so we'll just see a lot of examples here. First, you'll have a restatement of the purpose, main finding 1, finding details, further details, and form phrases are in green. So in sociology, here's the first sentence. Adoption from care has not been experienced equally across social class, gender, and race divides. I should say this is all one paragraph. This is one paragraph. I've separated them just to show you what the author is doing in the different parts of the paragraph. The paper illustrates how birth parents experience a significant amount of adversity. We could remove this, right? If we don't want to restate what you've said in the introduction. Poverty and associated factors such as A, B, and C are daily reality. It is also known that mothers go without food or necessities in order to protect children. So you can see here, as I think I mentioned in the discussion, you can also bring up other studies that support the findings. Not only in the introduction, you can discuss how the literature supports your methodology or gives a context and background. In the discussion section, you can show how what you found in your research is already shown by these other studies. So there's a consistency. You're building upon this other work, or you're saying, I've found something similar to what other studies have found. All right. So you're going to, let's see, interpreting the results. Okay, another paper, anthropology, which is, I believe, a social science, but skirts the line of humanities as well. So you're going to restate the purpose, give a main finding, give the finding details. Development is a political concern now dominating the third world. Main finding. The generalization that third world people are homogeneous was based on cultural essentialism. Finding details. This perception limited the intention of, so on and on. Anthropologists tend to find out these gaps in knowledge to value local cultures and knowledge before preparing development planning. This article, as I can tell just from this discussion, is not a research paper, but more of a survey or kind of a assessment of the literature, kind of a literature review. So you're going to see a little bit different content here, rather than our main finding was X. Here's the details of that. But you'll still see the structure of main sentence, topic sentence, with supporting details. And again, this is one paragraph. So the paragraph has an internal consistency that you want to apply in the discussion section. Let's discuss another writing issue, and that is redundancy. That just means repeating the same information. Here I want to discuss repeating the information from the results in your discussion. It's okay to interpret the results, but you don't want to just paste them in the discussion. So you can use a bridge sentence to relate the result to your interpretation. This sentence simply repeats the data. How can we change it to an interpretation? So here, the effect of disability status on residential outcomes persisted among renters and homeowners. You're just saying what your study found. This might be in the results section. By adding a verb and a reference to the data, you can make a sentence showing the reader how you're interpreting this data. So this is a form phrase here. Our findings revealed that the effect of disability status persisted among renters and homeowners. So even though it's slightly redundant, it's not absolutely new. You are adding value and information by telling the reader what your findings revealed, rather than just giving them the data point. And then the next sentence might be might be a further a deeper analysis of what the implications are of that, or what the details are of that, using the specific data from your study. Some good terms you can add here instead of revealed. Our findings suggest, imply, entail, establish, mean that. Our finding the X is more relevant than, reveal, create. So there's many verbs you can use, and we suggest using our verb list that we've created on our website to help you here. Here's some useful objects. So our findings suggest a connection between. Our findings imply a disparity. Our findings establish that A is greater than B. Okay, so you don't, again, rather than just putting the data, you can use these form phrase, a relationship, a connection, a disparity, as an object with this initial verb to create a sentence that is actually bringing something new in your discussion. Okay, let's discuss writing a conclusion in the social sciences. And as I mentioned earlier, the conclusion is kind of the exclamation point, or where you're going to sell your work. So you can summarize the findings, bring your study to a close. You can contain a summary of your findings without repeating the results, and restate your findings in a different way. So there's a lot of things you can do in the conclusion. This is where you can get a little creative without going beyond the bounds of scientific research. So looking at this paragraph in sociology, this is the final paragraph here. So you can see that this particular conclusion is summarizing the major findings, discussing the application of methods to different areas, and then discussing further research and questions that should be addressed. So here we have offered two theoretical frameworks. So here we've done this. Again, restating what you've talked about in the introduction. In addition to employing the use of this data, future research should do this. So we're discussing not what our study did, but what other studies could do in order to create better outcomes, or could answer similar research questions. How powerful actors such as housing developers, landlords, etc. Is an important question that needs to be addressed. So you're establishing the importance not only of your area of study, but what else that you might be looking at, and how other studies could answer the question better than your study did. Okay, let's look at another example in applied geography. It's looking at the form phrases. While our research has identified X, we note that blah, blah, blah. Thus, our future research could investigate X. Second, although the aggregate time cost of intercity trip from terminals are not significant in this research, future research could also study, so we have future research mentioned again. A detailed case study research could shed light on that. Okay, that's the final sentence. So in the humanities, you're doing something a little bit differently. As I stated earlier, you're summarizing the findings again, but you're repeating the thesis here while rephrasing the language. You're bringing your argument, your story to a close. And even in the humanities, tends to be even a little bit more creative or poetic with its conclusions. So let's see. An example concluding paragraph in fashion design. The purpose of fashion design is not only to pursue fashion and aesthetics, but also to expand a multidisciplinary, comprehensive design art. Entering a new era of science and technology, fashion design should be based on the people-oriented principle, developing to meet people's psychological and physiological needs. This could be the end of the paper, I think. But this author adds one more sentence extending, giving additional points related to the research and why fashion is applicable to other important domains. Nowadays, multicultural environmental protection and intelligent digitization have become the theme of fashion design. Let's skip ahead. People's demand for environmental health are gradually achieving the integrative development of production, green health, with the help of science and technology. So it's moved to beyond clothing design to something that encompasses all of humanity. So that's one way to conclude your paper. In history, let's look at the end here, where refinery workers once enjoyed an exceptional success within the larger story of Southern industrialization. They eventually fell victim to the same trends that weaken organized labor across the nation. This is kind of an extension of the thesis, a broader conclusion, if you will. Okay, some form phrases you can use for the discussion. To state the results expected, these results are in line with the study's hypothesis that it was hypothesized that X, and the results reflected this hypothesis. However, your study won't always yield the results that you anticipated. So if you have unexpected results, this finding was unexpected and suggests X. One unanticipating finding was that to explain the results, there are several possible explanations for this. One possible explanation is that, another possible explanation is that, again, these are all form phrases. They're not in green here, but they all work together to structure your discussion. Referencing literature and comparing to other studies. This result has not been previously described in similar studies. That sounds familiar. That sounds like the introduction. As study X concluded, citation might be needed, these findings are consistent with the previous research. And then give a citation. So you can see here that, especially in social sciences, less so in humanities, in introducing new literature that compares and contrasts and supports or contradicts your study is useful in the discussion as well as the introduction. Here's some more form phrases. For discussing wider implications, a larger issue that emerges from these findings is, one implication for these findings is, these tell the reader what you're discussing. Implication, very explicit. Suggesting further research. At present, several questions remain unanswered, and list your questions. A further study with more focus on X should be done to investigate. And then in conclusion, further studies that account for these variables need to be undertaken. This paper argued that X was important in determining Y. This is just a summary. Many ways to conclude your paper is what you can get from looking at these, but form phrases do a lot of work. Let's look at some vocabulary issues that are found in discussion and many other parts. This is incorrect verb use, so be sure to use the correct verb and tense when discussing your findings. The existence of stereotypes raising the possibility that minor groups will not be involved in new career roles in society. Other research must be done. What's the issues here? This looks like a sentence fragment because the verb is not conjugated correctly. So we need to make sure we use correct verb tenses. And we can use modal verbs. So will is a bit strong. So let's use modal verbs to soften it so it doesn't sound like we're telling the reader 100% this is what will happen. And then also, other research must be done. Doesn't sound very academic, so let's elevate this language. The existence of stereotypes raises the possibility that that minority groups might not enter new career roles in society. Additional research must be conducted. Other research must be done. Let's elevate this language. Okay, let's ask some questions before we move on to writing issues. Which is not a purpose of the discussion or conclusion section? To explain the results, to critique or justify the methods, to discuss the implications and suggest further research, or to introduce your hypothesis or thesis, which is not a purpose. This should be pretty obvious considering the language here, and that is to introduce your hypothesis. You should have already introduced this where? In the introduction, either at the end of it for a social science or towards the beginning for a humanities paper. Which writing issues does this sentence contain? Here's your choices. In this study, we have investigate the highly complex and dynamic behavior of signaling centers responsible for tooth patterning in the mouse jaw. We think that these differences in EDAR regulation may reflecting differences in the balance of the different processes participating in hair and tooth formation. So, again, we have two answers this time. And those are grammar or formatting issues. Where are the grammar issues? Well, we have investigated. We think that may reflect, right? Improper or non-academic terms. I think that think could be improved. So let's see how. We have investigated. We believe that these differences may reflect differences. All right, so there's almost always a better verb if you use these colloquial verbs. Let's discuss quickly some transitions that you can use. So we can include these in our writing issues as well, but I just want to talk about a few common transitions that you might know, but you might not know exactly how to apply. First one is therefore. Therefore means for this reason, and it is usually or almost always followed by a comma. The study sample was too small. Therefore, a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test was used. Thus means in this way. A comma or no comma, it doesn't necessarily need a comma. The patients were put into 3 rows. Thus the tests were conducted. Thus is often used to stand in for therefore, but it has a slightly different meaning. It means in this way rather than for this reason. So in this way, the tests were conducted. However means on the other hand or but, and it is always followed by a comma. Many studies have approached this issue from a pragmatic position. However, this ignores the more empirical aspects of the issue. So again, all these transitions doing a lot of work telling the reader what this upcoming information is doing, what it means. Okay, here's a couple more. Furthermore, additionally, this means this is also true. Instead of writing also, this is a good alternative. Testing and detecting discrimination against people with disabilities is easier in the rental market. Additionally, in the rental market, etc. Moreover means a larger point, a point that's connected but kind of not exactly the same point that you're making. And moreover is always followed by a comma. So moreover is kind of meta, like a meta point. Research of this tradition has yielded knowledge of this ancient people. Moreover, it has taught us much about modern society. So you're kind of shifting the lens. I like moreover. It's a sophisticated transition. Overall, or in sum, that means the larger point is. So you're going to use this often at the end of the introduction or at the end of the discussion section. This is kind of the main point, summing up. And it is always followed by a comma. Overall, variable y does not appear to have any major impact on stomach cancer. Actually, you can also find this in the abstract a lot, right? At the end of the abstract. In some, prognosis was extended in patients who received treatment. And then you've seen although and whereas have a similar meaning, even though. So the phrase is followed by a comma. The phrase at the end of this subordinating clause. Whereas previous studies have done X, comma, this study does Y. Although this study design addresses the research questions here, comma, further research further studies should be conducted. Okay, so you can find these, you should be using these transitions in your papers all the time. Let's just do one transition quiz. Which transition works best in this particular sentence? Historians have argued that the war saved the manufacturing industry. This is arguable, as manufacturing had begun to increase before the start of the war. Now, here's a hint. I had to give you this phrase here, otherwise you wouldn't know what to use. And that tells you how important the transition is. The answer is however, because I've given you this hint. This is arguable means this is not necessarily true, or people could argue against this, which shows that it's contradicting the first sentence. So if you were to just write this first sentence, historians have argued that the war saved the industry, and then period, as manufacturing had begun to, manufacturing had begun to increase before the start of the war, it's very hard for the reader to connect these two ideas. So adding however, and then you could erase this is arguable, it tells the reader that this is the counter argument, or this is the other information that needs to be considered. Very important to use. Okay, so let's discuss some common mistakes. Again, there's many kinds of writing errors to look at, and we know why good writing is important. I want to go through these briefly. You can find a lot of material online for how to fix these errors and which ones to identify, but it's important to know errors that you're likely to make. So let's just look at a few of these. So the categories will be grammar, punctuation, and mechanics errors, and then a few style issues such as wordiness, lack of flow, and non-academic terms. Okay, so let's start with determiners. Determiner is a modifying word that determines the kind of reference a noun or group has. So usually determiners are articles, a and the, and then every, each. Cancer is a major cause of death in the US. The results of the study are quite significant. Determiner misuse is the most common mistake that we find in any research paper from ESL students especially. It's because articles are silly. Too many languages don't use them. So you can figure out the rules, and once you know the rules, it's much easier to know how to apply them. Demonstratives are another determiner. This or these. This paper analyzes, these results indicate. You might think this is very simple, but mistakes are still often made. Quantifiers are another determiner. Many studies have been conducted. Most participants in each group received. All right, so let's just look quickly. You might have learned this in grammar class, but we can divide articles into countable, or nouns into countable and uncountable, and then we will know which article to use depending on what the purpose of the article of the noun is. So these are all uncountable nouns. So any of the uncountable noun, that means any of them, not a specific one, use the noun with no articles, and don't pluralize it. So it's not countable, so that means you don't need to pluralize it. You don't need to add s. So for example, drinking water has many benefits. Love is a strong emotion. Magic is crazy. Science is amazing. If you're referring to one specific uncountable noun, you'll use the to point at that particular noun. So for example, the water in this lake is clean. We examined the water bordering the town. Which water? If the question is which X, then you will probably use the. Remember to use the in the structure with the noun plus preposition plus noun too. So the heart of the city. The results of the experiment. Not the results of an experiment, because we're referring to a specific experiment. And usually these will already be referred to a little bit earlier in the study. That's why we're using the. All right, let's look at countable nouns. If you're talking about one member of that noun, use a or an with that noun. So any noun, any member. I want a car. Which car? I don't know. I want any car. A virus could have infected this specimen. Which virus? We don't know. A virus. If we say the virus, then we are referring to a specific virus that we've already discussed. When referring to all members of the noun in general, in its countable noun, use the noun with no articles. So colors can affect our emotions, or scientists have been researching this issue. Not the scientists, not the colors, because we're referring to all colors, all scientists in a particular group. The countable noun as a whole group use the. So the elephant is a large mammal, or the harp is a difficult instrument. You can also pluralize these, right? Elephants are large mammals. Harps are difficult instruments to learn. Can work as well. So if you follow these rules, you, in theory, won't make any mistakes with determiners. But with practice comes perfection, right? So let's practice. Which articles should you use here? We analyzed variety of tissue samples. A, N, the, or no article. A variety. So a word like variety is a more abstract grouping, so it's not a particular variety, it's just a variety. This is kind of this always goes together. It's an idiom. Experts identified lakes surrounding the compound as the source of infections in question. And these are the same article. The lake, the infections. And we've given you a hint here, right? Because we have this phrase, surrounding the compound, the lake, the particular lake. If in the paper later we said scientists came back to the lake, we know which lake we're talking about because we have described it here. So the is actually pointing to which lake we're talking about, or which noun. The source of the infections in question. Which infections? Those in question. So which X? The X. Finally, colors affect our perception of reality. Are these particular colors? No, any color. So colors. No article. Some demonstratives. I would like to go through these quickly. This or these, use these to refer to the items you just referred to. So these studies support the germ theory. This finding has great implications. You're going to use this in the discussion a lot. The aim of this study is to, this is in the introduction. But we don't want to use that or those as a demonstrative to refer to in conjunction with a noun. So that theory is common to most social psychologists. Instead, this theory. So we've just discussed this, and then we can summarize this theory is very common, not that. We can use those, but it's often used as a substitute for a subject or for a person. So those exposed to radiation were at risk. That means those people who were. So we could actually cut down on wordiness by using those. Those exposed to radiation. Those left in the 30-degree water shrunk more rapidly. Those test subjects. But how do we know we're referring to test subjects? Well, we should have used this subject before in a previous sentence so that we know that we're discussing, we know exactly what noun we're referring to. Qualifiers, generally, you can use them to show the importance of or discuss the literature in general. So many, most, some, all, none. Many studies have been conducted. Most Koreans eat kimchi at least 5 times per week. Some scientists disagree with these assessments. However, do not use superlatives such as all, no, or every unless you are 100% certain that this is true, right? It's a science. We don't want to boast or make large claims that we can't back up. So saying every relevant study supports this theory, well, perhaps not. So you might say the vast majority of relevant studies support this theory, or every relevant study we could find. You might want to qualify this, but just saying every or all, often that's not going to be true. Knowing the difference between few and a few sounds like the same, but it's not quite. So a few, just few, usually means not very many or not enough to be significant. So few relevant studies support this theory. That means this study has almost no support. You're dismissing it. Few people think that the earth is flat. Not many people. A few usually means some or several. It means more than none, actually. The connotation means that it could yield relevant information. So it's something that could be explored. So, for example, a few relevant studies support this theory. Most scientists don't agree. However, a few relevant studies do support this theory. This theory has some support. Maybe don't discount it altogether. All right, let's see which demonstrative or qualifier we should use. Few, most, these, those. 1. Results have several implications for this field. These, right? These results, referring to something we just discussed. Since studies come to the same conclusion, further research must be conducted for confirmation. Well, here's your hint. Further research must be conducted. Probably not enough studies, so few. Few studies come to this conclusion. We need to do more research. Not enough, not a significant amount of studies. Interested in becoming scientists should study diligently. Which one? Most or those can be used as a noun. It is those. Those people who are interested. Those interested. Polar bears are not native to most continents. So we can make a lot of mistakes with these demonstratives and qualifiers as well. So finding them when you're editing your own work or giving them to an editor can help you become better at identifying these and making fewer mistakes. Let's look at a few mechanics mistakes. I don't want to discuss punctuation mistakes because there's so many rules. So let's look at a few big mechanics mistakes. Starting a sentence with a numeral is a no-no. Do not start sentences with numerals. So 45, don't write the numeral, write out the number as a word when you begin the sentence. 45 students participated. If your word is longer than 2 letters, if it's 3 letters, or if it takes up too much space, it could be better to put this numeral in the middle of your sentence. So for example, there were 45 students participating in the survey. That could be better depending on the structure of the sentence, but never start the sentence like this. Capitalizing common words. Do not capitalize common nouns. This happens a lot with ESL students who don't understand how to capitalize nouns. So in this case, this research project was supported by the Seoul Metropolitan Government. The research project is generally, it's common, right? Even though you're talking about a specific one, that's not the name of the project. So instead of capitalizing this and putting Metropolitan Government in lowercase, it should be the opposite. This research project, lowercase, was supported by Seoul Metropolitan Government. Why are these capitalized? Because it's a specific government. It's the name of the government. If you said Metropolitan Government of Seoul, or the Metropolitan Government belonging to Seoul, then that wouldn't be the official name, so it would not have to be capitalized. Also, make sure your spelling is correct. That's an obvious one, and most spell checkers or Microsoft Word will help you with that. Subject-verb agreement is an important one. So a subject and its verb must agree in number. So let's look at disagreement in mid-sentence, phrase, or clause. So the causes of this disease is bad diet and lack of exercise. So even though bad diet is next to is bad diet, right? This is singular, but when we have and, we have to add them together. They become plural. So the causes of this disease are bad diet and lack of exercise. When we use compound subjects, we can put an incorrect subject-verb agreement, or the subject and verb could disagree. So a scientist and a doctor works in this office. Same rule. We have and, which combines them into, it becomes plural. A scientist and a doctor work in this office. The study's findings presents several implications. What's wrong here? Well, in this case, study's findings. Well, we're not talking about the study. This is actually possessive, so we're talking about the findings. Findings is plural, so present. This study's findings present several implications. Okay. We can look through here quick. These pronouns, indefinite pronouns, should be memorized as far as how they connect with the verb. So each, something, everybody, nothing, always should take a singular verb form. Whereas these plural, or these indefinite pronouns, both, many, few, several, some, always take the plural verb form. And this is when we're using these as a noun, so or as a pronoun, right? So we're not saying each person. We don't need to add that noun, right? Just each. Each receives. Nothing has been. Everybody is. And all of these take a plural. Both are qualified. Many failed. Few answered. Okay? Most molecules react. Right? These are in the past. Sorry, this is a little confusing, but many fail. You could say fail. This is past tense, but it works the same way. Few answer. Several retain. All right? Let's discuss the tense, because verb tenses are often misused in papers. So we want to make sure the tenses are consistent. Researchers worked on the project for 2 years. They collect samples and analyze data. Why is this a problem? Well, we have two different forms, which makes the reader wonder what was happening. What is the time? The time is confusing here. So we want to be consistent with our time when we're working within the same plane of time. Researchers worked on the project for 2 years. They collected samples and analyzed data. Researchers have worked on the project for 2 years. They collect samples and analyze data, right? This tells us they're still working on the project. Let's skip ahead. We won't take this test because we have to discuss wordiness, and this will be our last issue, I think, because of time. So a general way to decrease wordiness is to decrease nominalizations and prepositions. And if you just look at this sentence here, it's 56 words. You can decrease the words by getting rid of nominalization. What is a nominalization? That is when you use a noun with a useless verb, like give. So give a presentation, undertake a study. So instead of using the nominalization, you can just change this to give a presentation to present. And you can save a lot of words that way. And then some other ways are, let's see, from our attempts at forecasting fashion, from our attempts to forecast fashion, using a variety of various. You can save 2 words there. The first observation is that there is no single model. There are usually is not the strongest structure. So the verb exists is actually very useful. So whenever you see there is, you can say no X exists instead of there is no X. Okay, so just doing that in these 2 sentences, you've saved 9 words. You've decreased the sentence by 9 words. All right, so here we have nominalization, which is this one, and then repetitive language, which you can see there too. So I want to discuss briefly nominalizations. As I said, nominalization is a meaningless verb plus a verb that has been changed into a noun. So what you should do is delete the meaningless verb and convert the noun into the main verb. So for example, Joe will conduct research. Joe will research. Why do we need conduct? This is so common in manuscripts, but it's not always necessary. Sometimes it's okay, but this will make it stronger if you can get rid of these in most cases. The board will make a decision. Why not just decide? It's a stronger verb. It's the main verb, actually, so we don't need make. Decide. The approval of the plan was given by the committee. How about the committee approved the plan? Why do we need of the approval of the plan or the plan's approval? How about just instead of having the passive by the committee, we change committee to the subject and use the stronger verb proved. Their interpretation of the implementation of the Institute's program was insightful. You can see in these long nouns, nominalizations, where's the verb? Interpret. It's the first part. Implementation, implement. Right? You can see it. They insightfully interpreted how the institution implemented its program. So actually here using how, using a how or what phrase, you can shorten this as well. First was their introduction of their analysis of dreams by the drama patients. This is really confusing, gives me a headache. First, they introduced how they analyzed the trauma patient's dreams. Much more readable, much better. All right, we should take into consideration, we should consider the analysis of how X factors impacts B gene expression was conducted. How can we change this? Analysis of was conducted. We analyzed. Analysis, analyzed. We analyzed X factors impact on gene expression. All right, I'm going to skip this one. Phrasing. And what you see with the nominalizations is that what we call the strong verb is usually a Latin verb. It comes from the Latin. In academic research in English, the Latin is used, is generally considered more academic. So here's a good list of the phrasal verbs or the common English verbs we use in everyday speaking, how you can change these to a more academic verb in Latin. So let's say instead of the scientists look closely at, the scientists examine or analyze. These are Latin. Think about, consider, talk about, discuss, add up, calculate. There's a ton of these verbs, and I would say one way to edit your paper, to improve your writing without an editor, is to go through your paper and see if you can identify any phrasal verbs. Phrasal verb has a preposition, a verb plus preposition. So underline all these and then see if there's another way. Maybe go to thesaurus.com, type in Google or Naver, and see if you can find another term for that. And it will likely you'll find the Latin equivalent. So there's so many of those. Okay, let's look at, we didn't discuss these transitions, so let's not worry about that. What's also very important and what a lot of researchers get wrong is the verbs used, whether the verb tense used, past or present tense. We discussed how you should use perfect tense or simple past if you're discussing a specific study or general past studies. However, there's some other more standard rules. So for past tense, if you have prior research, right? Watson asserted that, we discussed that, right? This particular person, simple past, this. If you're discussing the results or observations made during your study, in the study, you will use the past. Mice in group B developed tumors. The present tense, however, is used for general facts. Earth revolves around the sun. Lions eat animals. Subject of the sentence is your paper or the study. So when you're interpreting your study results or you're talking about the importance of your paper, use the present. Our study demonstrates. Or when you are giving a conclusion or interpretation of any findings. So entropy may be involved in. Notice the modal verb. All right, let's look at some examples. So referring to prior research, the Bowen group hypothesized that there would be an increase in air pressure. Many studies done throughout the 20th century assess this affinity between carbon and nitrogen. So this is past tense now, so we could use present depending on the style, or what would we use for past? Perfect or simple past? We would use perfect, right? Because many studies, there's not a particular study being cited. For observations in your study, mice in group B who were exposed to radiation developed parietal lobe tumors. The stem cells in test group C get bigger upon exposure to this chemical. This is wrong for two reasons, right? It's not past and it's a phrasal verb. So how can we change it? How about enlarged? This is Latin and it's past, simple past. All right, for present tense, general facts. This is simple. Air pressure decreases, right? The average human skeleton has 270 bones. How can we improve this from a perspective of Latin? Well, contains is one way. Contains. When the subject of the sentence is your work, right? The study confirms previous findings. Our research indicates that a majority of healthy kidney donors, or the interpretation of current findings. So comorbidity seems to be a factor. I want to improve this. I want to use one more Latin word. Actually, this might not be straight from Latin, but a little bit stronger academic verb. Comorbidity appears to be a factor. The results of past studies are made stronger by. This is obviously too long, right? How about are strengthened by? So even though it's still a passive construction, it's still a little better, right? Strengthened versus made stronger. Okay, and just let's look very quickly at what editing looks like. This might be your submitted work. And then this is what the same work would look like after editing. And off to the side here, you can't really see it, but you would see comments from the editor discussing what they've done here, what kind of changes they've made, why they've added it, why they've changed or added articles, for example, or changed vocabulary words, and that would be to help give you a better sense of what they're doing to your work, and that could help you in the future to edit your own work as well. And that's what we do when you submit your work to us. I think we're pretty much out of time. I can look at a few frequently asked questions in case that you've asked these. So let's say our lecture is over and we're in the FAQ section. And thank you for listening until now if you're still here. So regarding introduction, basic question you might have: how do I know where to state my hypothesis or statement of purpose? As I mentioned, there are some rules, right? In social sciences, you want to place this near the end of the introduction, near the topic sentence of the last paragraph. That's not a hard and fast rule. However, you want to make sure two things: that you use the form phrase and make it clear to the reader that this is your hypothesis, this is your statement of purpose, and you want to follow the guidelines of your journal. Now, as we also said, for humanities, the thesis statement should generally be in the first paragraph or second paragraph somewhere, usually near the end of the first paragraph. Okay, how many sources should I cite in the literature review? Good question. And as usual, I can say depends on the journal, depends on the domain and the area of study, and it depends how long your paper can be. So if you have a word count maximum, you want to make sure that you're not citing too many sources. But generally, cite at least 3 to 5 additional studies for background and 1 to 2 studies for methodology. But if you're going into many more studies, just make sure that they're brief and that they're actually relevant. And when you cite them, you can just list them in the parenthetical citation, referring to your endnotes. So like 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, if they all refer to that background or that specific point that you're making. So the point is not to use unnecessary studies. And use your target journal as a resource for how many studies they use. And regarding the discussion section, you might ask, how many results should I discuss in this section? And that's important. That depends how many results you've talked about. You should discuss every result to some degree. You shouldn't spend too much time talking about every finding, every sub detail for each finding, but you should at least hit on every result. So one rule of thumb is to discuss all relevant major findings, but not too many. What does that mean? For less important findings, use an addendum. So if you think they don't, here's the rule of thumb. I'm sorry. If the findings don't help answer your research question, do not include them. Whether they undermine your hypothesis or whether they add to it or give some very interesting aspect to it that you didn't consider, you can use them. But if there's sort of extra information, generally you don't need it. If you think it's important, you can add it in another section. But you want to make sure that if another researcher is reading your work, would they be like, why is this included? Or would it be considered a finding that answers your research question? Should I mention other studies in the discussion section? I believe we discussed this, and the answer is yes. You should mention other studies that support or counter your study's findings or methodology, or studies that help answer further related questions. Use the same rules for external literature as you used in the introduction. Same rules. Okay, and if you have additional questions, I will hop on in another setting immediately after this. But I want to show you a few of our institutions that we support. And Yonsei, I believe, is one of these institutions, and we are always having new editors in different fields to help you. We have a lot of social science papers these days, and we very much look forward to you using us as a resource, because we have a lot of great editors with masters and PhDs in social science and humanities as well. Okay, so please visit. I mentioned a lot of resources here, verb lists and grammar resources and punctuation, etc. Go toessayreview.co.kr and you can find tons of material, a lot of them with my face on it, explaining these in greater detail. So this is where you can go. So thank you very much, and if you have no questions, then I will see you next time. And thank you for attending our webinar. Bye-bye.